The United States was still a new nation in 1809, the year Abraham Lincoln was born. The country's first president, George Washington, had died only 10 years earlier. And Thomas Jefferson, the third president, was just completing his second term of office. But the new nation was growing. Many families were joining the westward movement, journeying into the wilderness to clear land for farms and building cabins for homes. In 1809, Thomas Lincoln, his wife Nancy, and their 2-year-old daughter Sarah were living in a log cabin on a farm in Kentucky. Their nearest neighbors were 2 miles away. It was on a winter morning, February 12, 1809, that Tom Lincoln told his nearest neighbors,
"Nancy got a boy, baby."
The cabin, said to be the one where Abraham Lincoln was born, is now in a museum on the land that was once Tom Lincoln's farm, near Hodgenville, Kentucky. 2 years after Abe was born, the Lincoln family moved to a new farm at Knob Creek, Kentucky. They lived there for 5 years. And then in 1816, when Abe was 7, the family made a journey across the wide Ohio River to the new state of Indiana. Tom Lincoln had had some trouble with the land laws in Kentucky. He could never be sure that he really owned his farm at Knob Creek, and he knew that the laws were different in Indiana. Their new home was near a community called Little Pigeon Creek. It was winter when they arrived, one of the coldest winters in years. Later, Abraham Lincoln recalled what their new home was like.
It was a wild region, with many animals still in the woods. We settled in an unbroken forest. Though very young, I was large for my age and had an axe put into my hands at once. And from that time till within my 23rd year, I was almost constantly handling that most useful instrument. It was pretty pinching at times at first in Indiana, getting the cabin built and clearing for crops. But presently, we got reasonably comfortable.
Pioneer life meant hard work, and young Abe Lincoln was already beginning to develop the great physical strength that he would be known for in later years. Every day, one of Abe's chores was to walk to a brook about a mile from their cabin and bring back the family supply of water. And often he went with his older sister Sarah to gather wild nuts, fruits, and berries in the forest. But hard work was not the only difficulty that the Lincoln children had to face. Their mother died in 1817. And then, one day about a year later, Tom Lincoln told the children that he was going away for a few weeks and leaving them alone on the farm. 10-year-old Abe and 12-year-old Sarah would be left to care for themselves until their father returned. About 3 weeks later, when Tom Lincoln returned to the farm, he told Abe and Sarah,
"Here's your new mammy."
Sarah Bush Lincoln, Tom Lincoln's new wife, had been a widow. Now she and her 3 children, Matilda, Sarah, and John, were part of the Lincoln family. The wagon was loaded with household goods belonging to the new Mrs. Lincoln. There was a bureau worth $40. Tom Lincoln thought it was almost sinful to have such a luxury. For Abe, the best thing of all was to discover that his new mother owned some books. That was far more important to him than luxuries like the feather mattress that would replace the corn husks he had used as a bed. Abe's new mother would help to change the whole direction of his life. Years later, he said of her,
"All that I am or hope to be, I owe to my angel mother."
Sarah Bush Lincoln was sure that Abe would be a great man someday, and she was determined to help him. Sometimes she would do Abe's chores for him so he could go to school. It was a long way to school, 1.5 miles down backwoods trails. But school days did not come very often for Abe. On most days, he was needed at home to help with the farm work.
While in Indiana, I went to ABC schools by littles. I now think that the total of all my schooling did not amount to 1 year.
Even when he couldn't go to school, Abe would spend his spare time practicing what he had learned. He had a copybook where he wrote down things that especially interested him. Often, when he didn't have paper, he'd write on a piece of wood or a shovel and later copy it over on paper. Abe's cousin, Dennis Hanks, was living with the Lincoln family, and many years later, in an interview, Dennis recalled how Abe would sometimes sit writing his name over several times.
He'd call me over and he'd say, "Hey, Denny, look at that, will you? Abraham Lincoln. That stands for me. Don't look a blame bit like me, does it?" Appeared to mean a heap to Abe. Another thing, I never seen Abe after he is 12 that he didn't have a book, summers round. Mornings, he'd take a book and some cornbread, go off to plow or hoe. When noon come, he'd sit down under a tree and read and eat. There's one book full of tall tales. We called 'em yarns. I reckon it was them yarns he read that give him so many stories to tell after he got to be a lawyer. "Abe," says I, many a time, "them yarns is all lies." And he'd always say, "Denny, when a story larns you a good lesson, it ain't no lie." And he'd go on reading and chuckling to himself. And when he come to the house at night, he'd sit on his backbone by the chimbley and read. It didn't seem natural, nohow, to see a feller read like that.
The Book of Yarns was Aesop's Fables. Another of Abe's favorites was Pilgrim's Progress. This book, along with the Bible, helped to shape his religious ideas. And this book, The Life of George Washington by Parson Weems, also made a deep impression on young Abe Lincoln. He borrowed the book from a neighbor, and he read it through in one night. On his way up to bed, he slipped the book into a chink between the logs of the cabin wall. That turned out to be a mistake. By morning, the borrowed book was rain-soaked and badly damaged. Abe went to the neighbor who had loaned him the book and admitted that he had been careless. Damaging a book was a serious matter on the frontier. There weren't many books to be had, and they were expensive. To pay for the damaged book, Abe worked for the neighbor for 3 days, cutting corn stalks to feed the neighbor's cattle. It was hard work, and he still had his regular chores to do at home. But Abe had learned to take responsibility and do what had to be done. That was one of the reasons why many people began to have great respect for Abe Lincoln as he grew to be a man. Some people began to call him the rail splitter, a reminder of his life on the frontier, where he learned the values of self-reliance and hard work and the frontier spirit of democracy. People who knew him when he worked as a storekeeper respected his fairness and began to call him Honest Abe. Years later, when he ran for the Senate from Illinois, Lincoln became known around the country as a forceful public speaker who stood firm on his principles. But most of all, he became known as the president who led the United States during one of the most difficult periods of its history and succeeded in preserving the Union. Abraham Lincoln, the boy who grew up on a frontier farm and came to be loved and respected as the 16th President of the United States.